The snow had been falling since noon and showed no intention of stopping. Marcus Mitchell pushed through the glass door of the Lakeview Urgent Care with his shoulder. Both arms occupied, one wrapped around his daughter, the other clutching a plastic grocery bag that had split along the seam sometime in the parking lot. Nia was pressed against his chest, her face buried in the collar of his work jacket, her right hand curled against her stomach in a way that made his own chest clench. She wasn't crying anymore. She had moved past crying into something quieter, which was in some ways worse. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and old carpet, and the specific brand of fluorescent light that makes everyone look slightly unwell. There were 6 or 7 people already seated. A man holding his arm at an odd angle, 2 small children running circles around a woman who had given up trying to stop them. An older gentleman asleep under his own coat, a small television mounted near the ceiling cycled through a muted weather report. The closed captions said, "Another 3 inches expected overnight." Marcus approached the front desk and shifted Nia in his arms. "My daughter cut her hand," he said. "The glass she slipped outside. There was a bottle. Fill this out, please." The woman at the desk slid a clipboard across without looking up. "Insurance card. If you have one." He didn't. He almost said it, then didn't say that either. He took the clipboard to a row of plastic chairs near the window and sat down with Nia still in his lap. The clipboard balanced on his knee. Nia lifted her head slightly and looked around the room with the dull, measuring gaze of a child who has learned that emergency rooms are not particularly different from any other kind of waiting. That was when she went still. Marcus felt it before he saw it, the sudden quality of attention in the small body pressed against him. Nia's hand gripped his sleeve. He followed her gaze, across the room, near the magazine rack. A woman sat with her knees angled toward the door, as though she hadn't fully committed to staying. She was perhaps 30, with dark blonde hair pinned back unevenly, as if she had done it herself in a car mirror. She wore a camel-colored coat that was too thin for the weather. She wasn't reading. She wasn't looking at her phone. She was looking at nothing in particular, in the careful, controlled way of a person who is working very hard to look composed. There was a bruise along her left jaw, fresh, blue-edged. Nia stared at her for a long moment. Then she leaned up and put her lips close to Marcus's ear. "Dad," she whispered, very quietly. "I want her as my mom." Marcus went completely still. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to do with the particular ache the sentence created in his chest. Nia had said things like this before about teachers she liked, about the mother of a classmate who had fixed one of her twists once at a school event. But there was something in the way she said it this time that was different. Not wishing, not performing, just honest. The way children are honest when they think no one is really listening. The woman across the room hadn't heard. She was still looking at nothing. Marcus turned back to the clipboard and began filling in the blanks. He had been a single father for 5 years. Marcus was 34, which felt both younger and older than it sounded, depending on the day. He drove a delivery truck for a regional logistics company 6 days a week, starting at 5:30 inches the morning. The route covered the near northwest side, a patchwork of industrial blocks, residential streets, small commercial strips, and he had driven it long enough that he could do it in near-perfect silence, navigating by muscle memory, while his mind worked through the day's calculations. How many stops, whether the truck would make it, what Nia was going to eat tonight. On Thursdays, he picked up a second shift at a warehouse near Midway because the pay was slightly better, and Nia needed new shoes, and the timing belt on his truck was making a sound that his mechanic described as not ideal. On the 2 Saturdays a month when he worked a half day, he tried to do something with Nia in the afternoon. The library, the park when the weather allowed, the free admission day at the Natural History Museum, which she had gone through so many times she could identify most of the fossils without reading the plaques. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on North Ashland that had been built in the 1960s and renovated approximately never. The radiator in the living room clanged reliably at 2, 0 inches the morning, a specific arrhythmic sound like someone kicking a pipe, which he had long since stopped waking up for. The window in Nia's room didn't quite close. He had put a towel along the sill and told her it was to keep the draft out, which was true, and also to keep her from noticing that the latch was broken, which was more complicated. She knew anyway. She never mentioned it. That was one of the things about Nia. She noticed more than she said. She kept her understanding of their circumstances in a quiet, internal file that she referenced without complaint and without performance. She had never asked for things they couldn't afford, not once, not in the deliberate, self-conscious way of a child who had learned the lesson, but in the natural way, of a child for whom the lesson had never needed to be spoken. He didn't know if that was a good thing. He suspected it was both. Nia's mother, Danielle, had left when Nia was 3. Not a dramatic departure, no argument, no door slammed hard enough to rattle the frames, just a morning when Marcus had woken up and found a note on the kitchen table written on the back of an envelope. The note said that she was sorry, that she loved Nia, that she wasn't built for this. He had read it 3 times and then folded it and put it in the back of a drawer where it still was. He didn't hate her. He understood, or he had arrived over 5 years, at something that functioned like understanding, that some people encounter the specific shape of a life and know with clarity that they cannot carry it. He wished she had known sooner. He wished a lot of things, but hatred required an ongoing investment of energy he did not have. Nia didn't ask about her mother often. When she did, Marcus answered as honestly as he could manage, which meant saying what he knew and naming what he didn't, and not filling in the gaps with stories that might not be true. The truth was that he had been okay. Not happy. Exactly, happiness felt like the wrong word for a life that was mostly logistics and fatigue, but okay. He loved his daughter with a ferocity that surprised him sometimes, the way you can be surprised by the depth of your own capacity for something. He made her breakfast every morning, even when he was running on 4 hours of sleep. He read to her at night when she'd let him. He attended the school conferences and the winter concert and the parent volunteer day, where he had stood in the back of Nia's classroom for 2 hours, helping second graders glue cotton balls onto cardboard clouds, feeling out of place in his work jacket, a black single dad in a room full of polished ease, and feeling at the same time completely at home. He showed up. That was the whole of it mostly. The month of December had been particularly difficult. The building's boiler had failed at the start of the month and taken 11 days to repair, during which he and Nia had slept in their coats, and he had run the oven on low with the door open, which he knew was not recommended, and did anyway because the alternative was Nia shivering at the kitchen table trying to do her homework. His landlord, Gerald Fitch, a man who communicated exclusively through legally ambiguous texts, and who had once sent a passive-aggressive message about hallway lighting that Marcus still thought about occasionally when he wanted to feel irritated, had announced a rent increase effective January, $40 a month. It didn't sound like much. It was 60 hours of work at his second job, minus taxes. He was calculating whether he could pick up an extra shift in the first week of January when the grocery bag broke and the evening shifted. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks into December, Nia had slipped on a patch of black ice in the parking lot, gone down hard on her right hand, and connected her palm with the broken neck of a juice bottle that someone had left near the curb. He had wrapped her hand in a clean dishcloth, driven 9 blocks to Lakeview Urgent Care, and now he was sitting in a plastic chair filling out paperwork, watching his daughter watch a stranger across the room. Nia was 8 years old. She was small for her age, with deep brown skin and a crown of soft, dark curls that Marcus was terrible at managing and that she wore gathered back because that was the one thing he had learned to do competently, a low, slightly uneven puff that her teacher had once called very practical, which Marcus had decided to take as a compliment. She had dark brown eyes and a habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. Her teacher said she was sensitive. Marcus had decided he agreed, and that sensitivity was not a flaw, but a kind of instrument, one that Nia used with more precision than most adults managed. She had not made a single complaint since the parking lot, not one. He looked at her profile, the small, serious face, the way she was still watching the woman across the room without embarrassment or self-consciousness, just looking and thought, not for the first time, she deserves more than this. Not more than him. He didn't think that, but more than all the rest of it, the cold apartment, the broken latch, the secondhand everything, the long silences that accumulated in a home with only 2 people in it, one of whom was 8. The first time he had seen the woman was 2 hours earlier at the Shop and Save on Clark Street. He had taken Nia with him because he had no one to leave her with, and the refrigerator was empty in the way that wasn't just low, but genuinely bare. A half stick of butter, a jar of mustard, 3 eggs that he'd been rationing since Sunday. Nia had wanted to come because she said the store smelled like bread, and she liked that. He'd said, fine. She'd put on her coat without being asked. They had gone through the store with a hand basket, moving quickly, staying inside the budget he had calculated on the back of a receipt in the parking lot, $22. He'd done the math twice. Pasta, canned tomatoes, a block of cheddar, a carton of eggs, half a dozen bananas that were starting to brown, marked down to 60 cents. He had thought about the oranges and put them back, then felt Nia watching him do it, and felt the familiar small tightening in his chest that he had no useful name for. Pride was too simple. Shame was too dramatic. It was something in between, something that only existed in the act of a parent putting something back on a shelf while a child watched. Nia touched his arm. "The bananas are better anyway," she said. He looked at her. "Oranges are too much work," she said seriously. "You have to peel them." He didn't say anything. He put the basket back on his arm and they kept moving. Nia walked beside him, wearing her red wool coat and the purple mittens she had picked out at the resale shop. She moved quietly, which was her normal mode, occasionally touching things she didn't ask for, the corner of a cereal box, the plastic wrapping on a loaf of bread, the edge of a display, not wanting, just feeling the world. They were in the cereal aisle when they heard the commotion. The produce section was adjacent, and around the corner came the sound of something heavy falling, then a sharp exclamation, then a different kind of sound, a low, pained noise that indicated something had happened to someone who was not going to make a fuss about it. That particular sound. Marcus knew it from his father, who'd had the same quality, a man capable of real pain and incapable of showing it loudly. He rounded the corner without deciding to. Nia was right behind him. An elderly man, 70, maybe more, with white hair and a gray wool cardigan under his open coat, the kind of man who still wore a cardigan to the grocery store, was on the floor near the Apple display, sitting half upright, one hand pressed to his knee. The floor around him was wet from a puddle that had collected from the produce misters, and no one had put out a wet floor sign. A display of bagged citrus had been knocked partly off its stand. Standing nearby, not close enough to be helpful, was a man in an expensive blue coat, the kind with a shearling collar that cost more than Marcus made in a week, and the man was looking at his phone with the specific focused neutrality of someone choosing not to engage the practiced blankness of a person who has decided that a situation is beneath their acknowledgement. And crouching on the floor next to the old man was the woman. She had one hand on his shoulder and was speaking to him quietly. She was asking if he could move his leg, if he'd hit his head, if the pain was sharp or dull. She was also simultaneously scanning the floor around him, checking whether there was glass or any other hazard. She was doing all of this without looking up at anyone else in the aisle, without positioning herself to be noticed doing it, simply focused, unhurried, completely present with the old man in the way that required a certain kind of person, not kindness exactly, or not only kindness, competence, the kind that's been practiced enough to look like instinct. A store employee appeared from the back, a young man in a red vest who looked at the scene with the expression of someone calculating the paperwork. "Ma'am, were you involved in this?" The woman looked up. She had clear gray eyes and a cut on her cheekbone, not fresh, but recent enough that Marcus noticed and filed without examining. He fell. "The floor is wet here. There's no sign." "I saw her bump into him," said the man in the blue coat, still looking at his phone. His voice was flat and certain, the voice of someone accustomed to being believed. She was reaching past him and knocked him over. The woman's expression shifted, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the micro-expression of someone absorbing a blow they were not entirely surprised by. "That's not what happened, I saw it." The store employee looked between them. The old man on the floor, who was clearly the least important person in this conversation by everyone's assessment except Marcus's, was still sitting with his hand on his knee, looking tired. Marcus had been standing in the entrance of the aisle for about 15 seconds. Nia was at his side, her hand loose in his. He could feel her attention focused like a beam on the woman on the floor. Though he didn't look at her, he said, "It was him, Blue Coat." Everyone looked at him. He hadn't planned to say it, it had simply been true. And he'd said it. The way you sometimes just tell the truth because not telling it feels worse. He continued mildly. He was reaching for something off the top of the display. He knocked it into the gentleman. She was already down there helping him when I came around the corner. The man in the blue coat finally looked up. He and Marcus looked at each other for a moment. The man had the particular quality of someone who had not been directly contradicted in a while and didn't entirely know what to do with it. The small, affronted stillness of a person encountering friction in a world that usually gives way. "I have somewhere to be," the man said, and walked away. The store employee watched him go, seemed to make a calculation that involved the path of least resistance, and then bent down to help the old man to his feet. The woman, She was still crouching on the floor, finally looked at Marcus directly, not with gratitude exactly, which he appreciated, more with the steady, appraising look of someone reassessing a situation, recalibrating. Her gaze moved to him, took him in, the work jacket, the basket with the pasta and the cheddar, the small black girl standing at his elbow, and then settled. "Thank you," she said. "He was lying," Marcus said simply. Nia was looking at the woman with an expression Marcus couldn't quite name. Intent, curious, something private, something that had no language yet, and so sat in her face as pure attention. They had left the store 20 minutes later, Marcus carrying 3 bags, Nia carrying the bread and the bananas, which she liked because it made her feel useful. The parking lot was bad. Chicago in December after nightfall, with the temperature that had dropped to 17, the pavement was a thin, deceptive layer of compressed snow over ice. Marcus had told Nia to walk slowly, to hold his hand, to stay close to the parked cars where the ice tended to be less severe. He was fumbling with his key fob when the bag handle broke. The plastic loop tore free from the main body of the bag, a catastrophic structural failure at exactly the wrong moment. He lurched for it, caught 2 cans but missed the third. And in the pivoting and scrambling, he stepped sideways, directly into Nia's path. She went down. It happened quickly. Her feet slipped. She reached out with both hands, and her right palm came down on the curb edge where someone had dropped a juice bottle that had shattered and left the jagged neck standing upright in the ice. He heard the sound she made. It would stay with him. He was down beside her in an instant, the spilled groceries forgotten, his hands going to her automatically, her shoulders, her face, then her hand which she was holding curled against her stomach. "Nia. Nia, let me see." She showed him. The cut was about 2 inches long, not deep enough to see anything that would have made the moment worse, but bleeding steadily through the cold, depending on how you thought about it. He pressed his handkerchief over it. He still kept one, his grandfather's habit, one of the few things he'd inherited, and his dark brown hands pressed hard. "Okay," he said. His voice was very steady. He had learned with her to be very steady. "We're going to the clinic on Belmont." She nodded. She didn't cry, though her face was pale beneath the brown and the tears were right there at the surface. "Yeah, you're still holding the can of tomatoes." He looked down. He was. He'd been holding it this entire time without noticing. He put it in his jacket pocket, which made Nia's mouth do something almost like a smile, and he gathered the other salvageable groceries one-handed and carried her to the car. The triage nurse called Nia's name after about 20 minutes. Clara Hayes, that was her name, though Marcus wouldn't learn it until later, had moved from the magazine rack to a seat slightly closer to the window during that time. She had her coat on still, buttoned to the collar, her bag in her lap, her posture the careful neutral of someone maintaining composure through structure. She had not looked at Marcus or Nia again, which he noticed without finding it significant. She had the look of someone working through something in her head, and he understood the need for that kind of internal silence. The nurse who handled Nia's hand was competent and brisk, with the manner of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had decided that efficiency was a form of kindness. She cleaned the wound under running water while Nia sat very still on the examination table, her feet not reaching the floor, her free hand curled in her lap. Confirmed it didn't need stitches, applied a series of steri-strips along the cut with the precision of someone who had done this particular procedure hundreds of times, wrapped the hand in clean gauze. Nia sat through all of it without making a sound, though Marcus could see by the set of her shoulders how much she was concentrating on being still, the controlled effort of it, the breath held slightly too long between exhales. "She's brave," the nurse said. In that particular adult voice that talks about a child as though the child is a still life. Nia looked at her steadily and said nothing. She had opinions about being talked about. She was too polite to express them. They returned to the waiting room and sat back down in their original chairs. Nia was holding her wrapped hand in her lap with an expression of cautious ownership, like she was deciding whether to be proud of it. She turned it slightly and looked at it from different angles. "It's bigger than it needs to be," she said. "The wrap, it's like a club." She demonstrated the limited articulation available. "I can't do anything with it. It'll be smaller tomorrow." She considered this, then she accepted it and put the hand back in her lap. About 10 minutes later, a door opened from the back hallway, and Clara came back into the waiting room. She had a small bandage on her left cheek, just below the existing bruise, a fresh, white square of medical tape that had not been there before. She stopped inside the door and looked at the exit, then looked back at the room the way you do when you have made a decision but your body hasn't fully committed to it yet. Her eyes found Nia first. Nia was looking at her hand, then she felt the gaze or whatever it is that children sense and looked up, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other across the waiting room. The two children who had given up trying to run were now sitting with the tired woman, leaning against her. The man with the odd-angled arm had finally been called in. The room was quieter. Clara crossed the room. She didn't come straight to them. She went to the row of chairs one over from Marcus and Nia, set her bag down, took off her coat and folded it over the arm of the chair. Then she sat down. She angled her body slightly toward them, but not intrusively, a gentle orientation, leaving the choice of how to receive it entirely to them. She looked at Nia's hand. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Not performing kindness, not the theatrical warmth that adults sometimes deploy with children, the over-brightness that signals effort, just asking, the way you ask something you actually want to know. Nia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "A little. The bandage is tight. They do that so it doesn't bleed through. It should ease up in about 20 minutes once the wrap settles." Nia looked at her. "How do you know?" "I've seen a lot of wrapped hands." She paused. "I'm a nurse practitioner, and my brother cut his hand on a broken jar when we were kids. I took him to a place like this." Another pause, a small memory being handled carefully. "He cried through the whole thing, loudly. The nurses thought I was torturing him." "I didn't cry," Nia said. "I know. I noticed." It was the right thing to say, or more precisely, it was the true thing, said without performance, which happened to be the right thing. Something in Nia's face shifted, a small release, a muscle that had been carefully held going soft. She looked at Clara, not with the weariness she showed most new adults, but with something more open, something Marcus rarely saw her offer on short acquaintance. Clara had done none of the things adults usually did with Nia. She hadn't talked too brightly. She hadn't called her sweetie or honey or used the voice. She hadn't reached out to pat her arm or her head. She had simply made a space and waited, given Nia full authority over whether to step into it or not, and then met her exactly where she was. Marcus had spent years watching people interact with his daughter. He had watched teachers and coaches and well-meaning neighbors and the occasional date who'd thought engaging warmly with the child was the right move. Sometimes it was. More often it wasn't quite right, and he had become something of a student of the difference. Very few people managed what this woman had just done, he said quietly, so as not to interrupt what was still happening between them. "I saw you in the store, the produce section." Clara looked at him. Her expression was careful in the way of someone who has learned to assess before assuming. "I saw you too. How's the man?" "The one who fell?" "His daughter came about 10 minutes after you left." "He's fine, sore knee, no break." She paused. "Thank you for saying something." He was lying. Something passed across her face, at that, not surprise at his agreement but recognition, the particular expression of someone for whom being lied about is not a new experience. He was. Nia, who had been listening to the whole of this with perfect attention, said, "He had mean eyes." Both adults looked at her. "The man in the blue coat," she clarified. "When he said he saw you bump the old man, he didn't look at the old man at all. He was just looking at you." She shrugged slightly, the small movement of someone filing an observation. "That's what mean eyes are. When you look at someone but you're not really seeing them." Clara looked at Nia for a moment, then she said, "You're right. That's exactly what it is." Nia accepted this and looked back at her hand. Nia fell asleep about an hour into the wait. Insurance verification was taking longer than expected, which Marcus was navigating with the front desk in careful installments. She was in the chair with her head on his arm, breathing slowly, her wrapped hand resting on her knee. Clara had not left. She sat with her coat in her lap now, turned slightly toward the window where the snow was still coming down, steady and indifferent. Marcus didn't know why he started talking. Maybe it was the particular flatness of the fluorescent light, the way a waiting room has of making the normal rules of social boundary feel temporarily suspended. Maybe it was the fact that she looked like someone who was working hard not to fall apart, and he recognized that. "She doesn't sleep like this anywhere," he said quietly, so as not to wake Nia. "She's usually a light sleeper. Has to check that the door is locked twice before she'll go to sleep." Clara looked at Nia. Her expression was different from how it had been before. Something in it had come undone slightly. "She feels safe," she said. "She's 8. She should feel safe everywhere." "She will," Clara said. and then, or she'll learn to carry it very quietly, like most of us. He didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't pessimistic exactly, it was just the particular honesty of someone who wasn't performing comfort. "You said your brother," he said. She looked at the window. "He was sick when we were kids. For a long time. Our parents worked a lot, they had to, so I was with him most of the time after school." She stopped, started again. "He's fine now, has 2 kids of his own in Portland, but I spent about 4 years of my adolescence in waiting rooms, not very different from this one, and I learned that scared kids don't need noise. They need stillness. Nia's doctor told me something like that." After her mother left, Clara looked at him, not with sympathy, or not only sympathy, more with recognition. How old was she? 3. A pause. Does she remember her? Some things. I'm not sure which memories are real and which are stories she's assembled from things I've told her. He glanced at his daughter's sleeping face. "I try to be honest about the parts I know." "That's the most you can do," Clara said. "Not as a platitude, as a fact." The television changed to a commercial for a local car dealership. They sat in silence for a moment. The kind that isn't uncomfortable, the kind that has a shape. "The man in the store," Marcus said, "with the blue coat." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, "David Ross. We're together," she said it flatly. "He owns a property development firm. He's very good at seeming reasonable. I noticed. He's very good at making everything seem like my fault." She said it without drama, which made it heavier somehow. "He's been doing that for 2 years, and I kept thinking there would be a point where I saw it clearly enough to trust my own perception. Tonight was that point, I think." "What happened tonight?" She touched the bandage on her cheek. Not a gesture he was meant to see, just an unconscious thing, a hand finding where it hurt. "He told me I startled him." Marcus looked at the bandage, said nothing for a moment. Then, "He wasn't at the store by accident. Are you safe?" She looked at him, and something in her eyes changed, a flicker of something raw, and then carefully set aside. "I will be," she said. "I just need to." She stopped. "I'm not usually this forthcoming with strangers. You don't have to be." "I know." She looked at Nia. "She makes it easier. Somehow. She listens like she's already decided to believe you." Marcus followed her gaze to his sleeping daughter. "Yeah," he said. "She does." He came in at 9:17. Marcus saw him before Clara did. She had turned back toward the window to watch the snow, which had thickened again. David Ross came through the glass door with the particular quality of motion of someone who considers himself welcome anywhere. He wore the same blue coat from the store. He had an expression that might, from a distance, look like concern. He crossed the waiting room and stopped 2 feet from Clara. "There you are," he said. The warmth in his voice was calibrated very precisely. "I've been looking all over." Clara went still. Not afraid. Marcus watched her carefully, and it wasn't fear exactly. It was the stillness of someone who has just moved from one state into another. She turned to face him. "I'm fine, David. You didn't answer your phone." His eyes moved to Marcus without moving his head, which was a specific kind of dismissal. "Who's this?" "Someone I met," Clara said. He sat down in the empty chair on her other side, which meant he was now flanking her, and began to speak in a low, reasonable voice. Marcus couldn't hear all of it. "Something about coming together, something about overreacting, something about the clinic. I know downtown, where the doctors were better. Everything presented as concern. Everything structured as an offer." Nia stirred. She didn't wake up fully, but she shifted, and her eyes opened halfway, unfocused, and she looked at David Ross with the direct, unguarded gaze of someone still half in a dream. Then she was awake. She sat up slowly, looked at Clara, looked at David, and pressed slightly closer to Marcus's side. David glanced at her. "She yours?" he said to Marcus. "Cute." He turned back to Clara. "I have the car outside. It's cold. Let's get you somewhere warm and talk about this like adults." Clara looked at her hands. She was very quiet for a moment. Then she said, "To no one in particular. I need some air." She stood. David stood immediately with her. Marcus stood too. David looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in the work jacket and the worn boots and the general quality of a man who has been on his feet for 14 hours. He did a thing with his mouth that wasn't a smile. "You're a delivery driver," he said. "She doesn't need rescuing by a delivery driver." "I didn't offer," Marcus said mildly. Nia looked at David Ross. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with the flat, clear gaze of a child who has learned early to read the temperature of a room and had taken her reading. Then she looked at Clara with something else entirely. David put a hand on Clara's elbow. Light, proprietary. Let's go. Clara looked at his hand on her elbow. She looked at it for a long time, then she said, no. David's expression didn't change immediately. That was the first thing Marcus noticed, the particular, practiced patience of someone who was accustomed to waiting out resistance. Clara. The voice was careful now, lower. You're upset. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking very clearly, she said. You hit your head. You're emotional. I didn't hit my head. She said it evenly. You hit my face, and I didn't hit my head. A small silence. You're being dramatic, he said. You know how you get... I know exactly how I get, Clara said. I get quiet, and I stop arguing because it's easier. I get small, and I stop taking up space because it's easier. I get... She stopped and took a breath. When she continued, her voice was level and without heat. I'm not dramatic right now, David. I'm not emotional. I'm not confused. I'm done. Clara, I want you to leave. We have things to discuss. The apartment, My lawyer can discuss them, she said. Leave. He looked at her for a moment, then at Marcus. The calculation happened quickly, and whatever it produced a decision that moving forward here was not worth the particular trouble it would create. He was good at that kind of math, Marcus thought, knowing when the room had tilted. This is a mistake, David said. Probably several of them, Clara said. Goodbye. He left. The door opened and closed, and the room was just a room again. The television, the fluorescent light, the two children who were now asleep on a chair, the man with the odd-angled arm who was finally being called in. Clara sat back down. She sat in the chair and put her hands in her lap and looked at them. Nia reached across the space between her chair and Clara's and put her small, gauze-wrapped hand very lightly on top of Clara's hands. She didn't say anything. She just rested it there. Clara looked down at Nia's hand. Her face did something complicated. A pulling together, a gathering, and then the slow, careful release of something that had been held for a long time. She didn't cry. She just breathed. They were called in for Marcus's insurance verification at 9:45, and the entire process resolved in 12 minutes because the woman at the front desk had apparently had enough of her shift and moved through it with efficient goodwill. When they came back out, Clara was still in the waiting room. She had her coat on now, buttoned again, bag over her shoulder. She looked like someone preparing to do something that required preparation. Marcus stopped in front of her. You have someone to call? He asked. My friend Jess, she said. She's in Wicker Park. She'll come. That's a 40-minute drive in this weather. I know. She said it without self-pity. It was just information. He looked at the door. He looked at Nia, who was standing at his side with her coat zipped to her chin and a wrapped hand tucked against her stomach, and the particular watchful expression she wore when something was being decided. I can drive you, Marcus said. Clara looked at him. It's not. He paused, choosing the words carefully. I'm not trying to be something. I'm just going north anyway. Wicker Park is 5 minutes out of the way. She studied him with that careful, measuring look. You don't know me. You took care of my daughter for 2 hours without being asked. She took care of me, Clara said, and glanced at Nia. And there was something in the look, something warm and honest and slightly startled, the way you look at something that has unexpectedly moved you. Nia, who had been listening to all of this with the rapt focus of someone watching a chess match she completely understood, took one step forward. Our car smells like fries, she said. Clara looked at her. Dad drops them sometimes. He says it's an accident, but I think it's on purpose because it smells nice. Nia considered this. But it's safe. The car. It's safe. A pause. Clara laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that bypasses whatever composure you've been maintaining for the last several hours and simply escapes because it has to. It lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the quality of the air in the room in a way that Marcus felt in his sternum. Okay, Clara said. She looked at Marcus. Okay. The car was a 2011 Chevy Malibu with 160,000 miles on it, and a check engine light that Marcus's mechanic had assured him was not the serious kind. It did, in fact, smell faintly of French fries. Nia took the back seat without being asked and was asleep again before they reached the end of the block, her cheek resting against the window, her wrapped hand held carefully against her chest, even in sleep. Marcus had put his work jacket over her like a blanket. The city was quieter than usual. Snow did that. It muffled things, smoothed the hard edges, made Chicago feel briefly like a different kind of place. The street lights were haloed. The plows hadn't come through yet on the side streets, and the Malibu moved through 4 inches of unmarked snow that made a soft sound under the tires. Clara sat in the passenger seat with her bag on her lap and her eyes on the road ahead, not tense, just quiet. They drove for 3 or 4 minutes without talking. Then she said, "Can I tell you something?" "Sure." I stayed with him for 2 years because I kept thinking I was misreading the situation, that I was the problem, that if I was just clearer, more patient, more... She stopped. "I'm good at my job. I'm a nurse practitioner. I read situations for a living, and I couldn't read my own life clearly enough to trust what I was seeing." Marcus drove. He let the sentence sit. "That's the part that gets you," he said finally. "Not the obvious stuff. The way it makes you doubt your own perception of things. You know, someone who... No, He considered it. I've had moments where the story I was telling myself about my life and the actual facts of it were very different, and that gap is disorienting. I think you can put up with a lot of pain before that confusion resolves." She looked at him. "How'd you resolve it?" "Nia." He said it simply. "You can fool yourself about a lot of things. It's harder to fool yourself when you have a kid watching." Clara looked at the rearview mirror at Nia's sleeping face. "She's remarkable," she said quietly, like it was a private thought that had gotten out. "She is." He paused. "She almost never takes to people like that." "She reminded me of my brother," Clara said. "The way she went still when she was listening, like she was giving you her full attention as a gift." Marcus drove another block in silence. "What you did in there," he said. "With David, that took... I've been rehearsing it for 6 months," she said. The actual saying of it was the easy part. It was all the rehearsing that was hard. It was still brave. She turned slightly away from him toward the window, and he had the impression she was deciding whether to accept that or deflect it. After a moment, she said simply, "Thank you." A left turn, then 2 blocks north, then another left. The neighborhood was residential, 3 flats and bungalows, most of the windows dark. One house had Christmas lights still on, blue-white in the snow. "The one on the right," Clara said. "The brick 2-flat." He pulled up. The building was solid-looking, older, with a small porch light on, not fancy, warm. He put the car in park. Neither of them moved for a moment. "I don't know what I'm doing next," Clara said. She said it thoughtfully, not with distress. "I have to sort out the apartment. It's his, technically. I need to find something else. My friend Jess has a spare room. There are about 15 things I have to figure out. One at a time," he said. "That's what my brother always says." "Smart guy." She smiled. It was a different smile from the laugh in the waiting room. This one was slower, more personal. "He really is." She looked at the building, then at Nia in the back seat, then at Marcus. She's going to wake up and be annoyed she missed the end of the drive. She'll ask me to tell her what happened. "What will you tell her?" He thought about it, that we dropped you off, that you were okay, that you were figuring things out. Clara nodded. She put her hand on the door handle. Then she paused. "Marcus." "Yeah." "I don't." She started over. "I'm not in a place to be anything right now. I want to be clear about that." "I know, but tonight was." She stopped again. Looked at the dashboard. It was a kindness from both of you. "And I don't know how to." She stopped a third time, and this time she just let it stop. "You don't have to know how to," he said. She looked at him then. A long, direct look that wasn't anything more than what it was. 2 people seeing each other clearly, briefly, in the particular light of a difficult night. "Okay," she said. She opened the door, got out, turned back. In the back seat, Nia stirred. Her eyes opened, half-focused, traveling around the car in the disoriented way of someone mid-dream. She found Clara standing in the open doorway in the snow, and she looked at her the way she had looked at her across the waiting room, that same intent, private recognition. "You can stay," Nia said. Her voice was thick with sleep, barely conscious of what she was saying, until the scary part is over. Clara stood in the open car door with the snow coming down around her and the porch light on behind her and looked at the small, half-sleeping face of this child she had known for 4 hours. She reached into the car and very gently, very carefully, touched Nia's hair. "Get some sleep," she said softly. "You were so brave tonight." Nia's eyes were already closing again. Clara straightened, looked at Marcus once more. He held her gaze without expectation, without pressure, without anything except the simple acknowledgement of one person to another at the end of a long night. She stepped back, closed the door. He watched her walk up the path to the porch, her coat too thin for the weather, her steps steady in the snow. She didn't look back, which he respected. The porch light stayed on as she went inside. He sat for a moment. The heater was running, pushing warm air against his hands on the steering wheel. Nia breathed behind him, even and slow, anchoring the silence the way children do when they're deeply asleep, making the world around them feel briefly uncomplicated. He had her name. He didn't have anything else. No number. No way to reach her, and he had not asked for anything else. Because she had told him she wasn't in a place to be anything right now, and he had meant it when he said, "I know." That kind of honesty deserved to be honored exactly as it was given, without footnotes or conditions. But he knew her name, Clara Hayes, and she knew his and Nia's. And the way the car smelled, and the specific quality of his daughter's attention when she decided to trust someone. These were not small things. They were, in fact, the things that mattered most. The residue that stays after an evening empties out. He put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb. Nia made a small sound in her sleep, not words, just the sound of someone deeply at rest. He reached back without looking and adjusted his jacket over her shoulder where it had slipped. He drove home through the snow. The city was quiet and white and cold, and the roads were nearly empty, and the check engine light glowed its soft amber on the dashboard, and the heater made a low, steady hum. And Marcus Mitchell drove with both hands on the wheel through the particular hush of a Chicago winter night and thought about very little and everything at once. She had laughed. That was what he kept returning to, not the confrontation with David, not the moment in the parking lot, not even Nia's whisper in the waiting room, though all of those things were real and would stay with him. What he kept returning to was the laugh, sudden and unguarded, the kind that escapes rather than being offered. It had lasted only a few seconds, but it had changed the quality of the air in a way he still felt. It had been so obviously real. And in a night full of things that required effort, realness felt like the rarest thing produced. He didn't know what came next. He knew he had a rent increase in January and a timing belt that needed attention, and a second job that was already taking 48 hours a month he could not spare. He knew Nia's next checkup was the second week of January, and that her teacher had mentioned she'd been quieter than usual this fall, which he had been thinking about in the background of everything else. He knew his life was a set of precise calculations performed under consistent pressure, and that this had been true for 5 years, and that he had not broken yet. But he also knew that tonight something had moved. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where one encounter solves everything, where a chance meeting reshapes a life in a single evening. That was not what had happened. What had happened was smaller and therefore more durable. A woman had laughed in a waiting room. A child had held a stranger's hands. Two people had told each other true things without being asked to. That was the beginning of something. He didn't know what. He didn't need to. Not everything has to be solved tonight. Some things just have to be begun. The snow covered the tracks behind them almost immediately, smoothing everything, making the road look new.
What do you do as a single dad when people with money and smooth voices think they can define the truth for you? They dismiss with a smile, they control with a calm tone. What would you have done in that waiting room? And have you ever had to trust your child's read on someone before? Subscribe for more stories like this, and if this one stay with you, leave a like too, because in the end, it was the truth spoken out loud, and a little girl's steady honesty that protected what mattered most.